It was 400 years ago when a group of folks made their way across the Atlantic Ocean in a ship called the Mayflower and landed at Plymouth. I'm sure you're familiar somewhat with the story, part of our American story. And when I say 400 years, exactly 400 years, it was November 11th, 1620, that the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth. And so this time of year, a lot of people talk about pilgrims, especially because it's Thanksgiving. When I'm recording this, it was Thanksgiving just a couple of weeks ago. And with Thanksgiving, I kind of took the opportunity to start reading a book that I just heard about. I think it was published this year probably in commemoration of the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower landing. It's a book entitled They Knew They Were Pilgrims by John G. Turner. They Knew They Were Pilgrims. And it's basically a history of the Plymouth Colony. Very detailed, very intricate, a lot of history. It's packed full. This isn't a criticism, but it's a pretty dense book. And so sometimes I make these YouTube videos on book reviews that I try to post every Friday. Probably won't in the next couple of weeks with Thanksgiving. With the holidays coming up and some other personal things. But on these Friday book review videos are things that I've been reading that I would recommend to you. And this is one of those books that I probably wouldn't recommend them to a lot of people. Not that it's bad. There's nothing wrong with the book whatsoever. It's a great book. But unless you are really interested in history, specifically American history, early American history, the 1600s, the 17th century. This is probably not a book that you're going to really gravitate to. But if I spark your interest, go ahead and read it. It was very interesting. He deals with a lot of things. The subtitle of the book, and it's kind of the argument that he's making here, is what was the subtitle of the book? Something along the lines of the Plymouth Colony and the contest for American liberty. I think it's what it was. And so he deals with the fact that they were grappling during that time period of exactly what does it mean to have self-government, and really experimenting with that, and made some missteps and overcorrection and back and forth, and a lot of things were going on during that time period that made it very interesting. And when I say he makes the argument, I think that's what he's getting at, even though it's not a polemic argumentation type of book that he's saying, here's my case. He just lays it out there as pretty much straight up history, but it's pretty easy to connect the dots. Then he has a short little conclusion at the end. He kind of pulls everything together somewhat and says, this is what I'm wanting you to see with this. It was a very interesting book. There's a lot of discussion about that time period now in the history of America and its founding, and all the way back before that. And there are some that there's kind of two extremes, and Turner doesn't hit either one of those extremes. On the one extreme, you have people that almost deify the Pilgrims, and you have that one picture of the Pilgrims, giving them a lot of credit for a lot of different things. And then you have these others that's real popular today that goes the opposite extreme and demonizes the Pilgrims, the 1619 Project. And if you're familiar with that, where they basically say the root of all problems in America and all problems in the world are because of these horrible white Europeans that invaded America and with their evil intention and all the rest. And I like the book because he doesn't fall into either one of those extremes. He does talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, and instead of demonizing them, he explains it's difficult, it's complex, it's complicated. For example, religious liberty. For example, a lot of people will point to the Pilgrims as, coming to America for religious liberty. And then there's those that really like to say, oh no, they were for religious liberty for themselves, but they were against religious liberty for other people. He explains that's pretty much overly simplistic. We kind of take religious liberty and freedoms in America for granted now, today, and it's hard for us to put our minds back over 400 years ago in the mindset that they would have had, that they were grappling with these things. Turner humanizes it and explains these stories and tells these stories and the narratives and the discussions that they were having and the debates and the real life circumstances that they were going through, and really helps to understand it. My kind of takeaway was it's a complicated issue, and so I thought it was very interesting book, very helpful to think through some of those things. For example, religious liberty, that how does that exactly work in a society where the difference between the church and the state that really hadn't been worked out yet, and so we forget sometimes that it's not just a straight connection with these ideas developing. Thomas Jefferson and William Bradford weren't sitting around a pub in Boston, hammering these things out and doodling it on a napkin. William Bradford lived, over 150 years before Thomas Jefferson. It was actually, if you think about it, the time period between the landing of the Mayflower and 1776 is right out about the same time differential as 2020 today back to the war between the states. So a lot of water went under the bridge in over 100 and something years. And the Plymouth Colony and the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Boston and all the interaction in that time period, they were hammering those kind of things out. And Turner paints a very interesting picture of that time period. But he doesn't just deal with the political things. He, like I said, is very humanized. One of the chapters that I thought was very interesting was his chapter on infant mortality and, children dying, and, people didn't live very long because of sickness and everything else in that day. And he really explains that from a human perspective, telling these stories, these horrible stories, heart-wrenching stories about it. He pushes back. Well, he didn't mention it, but this is from my perspective. I've kind of always heard that, well, sure, people died early back then, and they had children. Almost every family had children that died, but that was just part of life. They didn't know any better. They kind of got used to it, and they were calloused, and they just, a child died, you have a funeral, you go back to work. Well, Turner explains in the book that's not necessarily the case. It was soul-wrenching for a lot of people. For the society, not just a lot of people, for the whole society, everybody. He tells a few heartbreaking stories. One guy I'm thinking of, he mentions had 14 children, I think, and 7 of them died in childhood, and that'll mess with you. It would mess with you today, and back then it was no different. It was horrible, and so that's what I mean by really a humanizing part of the story. But anyway, I don't want to take up too much more of your time because, but I did want to mention what I've been reading and recommend it to you if you're interested in that kind of thing. It is They Knew They Were Pilgrims by John G. Turner. I'll put a link in the description like I usually do. You can pick it up on Amazon if you'd like.